Good afternoon. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn webinar focused on the electricity market in New York State in the Northeast. My name is Mark Levine, and I am the Executive Director of the Municipal Electric and Gas Alliance and the Deputy Director of the New York State Association of Counties. MEGA was created 27 years ago by two counties to serve the energy supply needs of counties and local governments across the state. We currently provide electricity and natural gas to 30 counties and more than 235 local governments and school districts across the state. Part of MEGA's mission is to provide energy-related resources and training to help local leaders make more informed decisions. The long-standing partnership between MEGA and NYSAC helps us achieve that mission for our collective members. That couldn't be more important than in this energy transition we find ourselves in here in New York and around the world. MEGA does a public procurement through one of our members, helps choose the most competitively priced suppliers, and includes language that allows all other local governments to piggyback off the contracts with these bid winners. Our last two procurements were conducted by Genesee County, and I see Chet on the line. Thank you, Chet, for all your work with us. The winner of that electricity supply bid was Constellation Energy. We have an expert from our Constellation team here with us today to discuss today's volatile electricity and energy market. First, a few housekeeping announcements. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please put them in the chat. We will get to those questions either as they arise or at the end of the presentation. We will be recording this Lunch and Learn webinar, and we will make that available for our members on the MEGA website and through our Energy Update newsletter. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Our speaker is Britt Lyons. She's the principal of Constellation's Commodities Management Group. Britt has been with Constellation Energy for over a decade, working in various functions from operations to pricing. In her current role, she has provided energy market intelligence and strategic analysis to Constellation's commercial and industrial customers, seeking to deliver market insight, innovative deal structures, and execution strategies for our customers to enable them to make better energy decisions. Britt specializes in various regions for both the gas and power markets, including the New York ISO and the ISONE. Britt, it's my pleasure to introduce you. Thank you very much for being with us here today.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Okay, let's get this kicked off. And, like Mark said, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll try to address those. I have a couple of slides I wanted to cover today just to really go over, what is driving prices right now in the energy market in New York. This first slide is just kind of meant to be a refresher. If you look at the chart on the top left-hand side, this kind of shows the breakout. So Constellation is a retail electric supplier. You have about half of your energy spend for electricity coming from the supply side. The other half comes from, the utility for distribution charges. If you look at that pie chart, you can see that the actual energy costs make up the largest portion of your supply costs, about 70%, and that varies a little bit just based upon what zone you're in, what your load factor is. And then the remainder of those costs are what we call non-energy components. Those are things like capacity, ancillaries, transmission project costs, and costs tied to the Clean Energy Standard, different programs that the state runs. So again, today we're kind of going to talk about all of those components. I really want to focus kind of on the energy piece because, as you can see here, that represents the largest portion of your supply costs. The additional charts on this page are just kind of some price trends that you can look at. I'm going to recover these later in the presentation, so I won't spend so much time here, but one thing I will highlight is the chart on the top right-hand side, that 24-month fixed price term. That's really kind of looking at the price trend for an all-in fixed price. So this is, again, the supply portion of that. And you can see how over the last 5 years, prices really have trended higher. Obviously, some dips and a little bit of volatility in there overall, but prices have trended higher, and that's because even when we see movement up and down in the energy market, generally we've seen those non-energy costs moving higher across the board in the last 5 years. So that's kind of an important thing to note, because some of these cost components really didn't exist until the last few years, and so they are kind of pushing prices higher, in addition to what we're seeing just in terms of volatility in the energy market as well. So I wanted to highlight that. If we look at the next slide here, this is just a couple bullets on really what the key market drivers are right now. Obviously, weather's an easy one. We're always going to see some demand patterns shifting with weather, primarily in the peak seasons like winter and summer, where you see stronger demand. We did see a colder than anticipated winter this past winter. That was supportive of prices and kind of tightened the supply-demand balance. We'll look at the aftermath of some of that. This summer is expected to be more mild than last summer, but still above normal on a national basis. 13th warmest nationally. We'll look at an early forecast for that. And then the other thing really to kind of focus on in terms of what's driving prices is, like I said, the supply and demand balance. In New York, our electric generation comes from a blend of resources. Nuclear provides, between 25 and 30% of baseload generation in the state. We also get, a good amount of hydroelectric imports from Canada. So I want to kind of touch on that and some impacts from, tariff situation. And then natural gas, really, especially during peak periods, is typically the fuel on the marginal fuel. So it's what sets prices in winter and summer. And so we watch very closely, what's happening in terms of fundamentals in the natural gas market, because those are very strongly tied to, what we see in terms of energy prices. And so I'm going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into what some of those drivers are. But very high level, we've seen a little bit of a flip to where in the next 2 years, so the remainder of 2025 and into 2026, a lot of the market forecasts indicate tighter supply and demand patterns. There's a variety of reasons for why that is, and we'll talk about some of those. But when you see that supply and demand balance tighten, it is supportive of prices. And so, that's a little bit of what we're seeing happen right now in the forward market. And something that's important to note, because really over the next 5 years, there's a lot of demand growth anticipated in both the electric space and the gas space. That's a big part of why we see this kind of tighter supply-demand balance. That's supporting prices. And so when we see these little blips in the market where prices pull back for whatever reason, it's a good opportunity to really take advantage of those blips. Another thing that we're seeing right now, and we'll look at some of these in the price charts, but is what's called backwardation in the market, where the further out you go, the bigger discount you're seeing in the gas and electric rates right now. And so it's a good time to kind of look at, considering a longer term purchasing strategy or contract to get in at those lower rates. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. The big things to watch moving forward outside of just those supply and demand fundamentals are, what's happening with policy and regulatory issues, both at the federal level, also at the state level. That has a large role in the energy market functions, and also, at the state level, some of the non-energy components that I talked about through various programs that the state has implemented. And then obviously, whatever the outcome of this summer is, we will take an early peek at those forecasts, but it is just a forecast. And so that's something that could certainly change prices and the supply and demand outlook in the near term. And the last slide that I have here in the intro is just, this is looking at NYMEX, so natural gas, Henry Hub natural gas prompt month prices. I really just wanted to kind of re-illustrate, how volatile the market has been. Especially this time of year. Typically, you see more downside pressure because we're in shoulder season, and really we've seen some support even this time of year, just having to do with how quickly some of these fundamentals are shifting, having to do a little bit, I think, with market response to some of the tariffs and federal policy outcomes. And so again, just kind of a good visual for, how volatile things are right now in the marketplace. Okay, so moving into some of the supply and demand fundamentals, like I mentioned, this summer is expected to lean a little bit cooler than last summer, and really even, as far as what we've seen in the last few years, we've seen some record warmth in the summer. Last year, we saw the second warmest summer on record on a national basis. This summer, we're expecting to see the 13th warmest on record with 975 cooling degree days. That is slightly cooler than the 10-year normal. It's more on par with the 30-year normal. And again, we've kind of been in this warming trend. So, even though overall you can see in that map on the left-hand side, things are expected to be above normal, it's still on the cooler side relative to what we've seen in the last 10 years and relative to what we experienced last year. You can see the significant above normal heat is focused on the western part of the nation. That directly correlates kind of to that drought monitor that you see there on the lower left-hand side. But one key thing that I want to highlight is that there is lower confidence in the summer model this year because of the fact that we have a weak ENSO signal. So that's the water temperature deviation. And when that happens, that's similar to what we saw this winter. When that happens, it does make the weather difficult to predict because other kind of key indices can come into the pattern and take over. And so that's why we saw some of those colder temperatures this winter. That's why we've seen this even volatile weather pattern this spring where you have a brief warm up followed by a brief cool down. It's some of these other things like blocking or ridging, can take over the pattern, and that's causing some volatility and making, the summer a little bit harder to model. So again, we have an idea of what things might look like, but this can certainly shift. And one kind of key right now is indicating that July, we could start to see that volatile pattern break a little bit and see some more consecutive warm weather actually show up for parts of the east, the northeast, the northern tier, et cetera. And when that happens, you can see higher prices as a result. So again, really kind of some response to prices when that happens, making sure that you are looking to hedge positions around summer and winter, especially in New York and the Northeast, is going to be important. Okay, looking at a brief update on tariffs and sort of the timeline here with what's happened. I'm not going to go through all of this in detail. I made a little chart that kind of just shows, over the course of the last 60 to 90 days, what has happened in terms of some of these tariffs? They've been announced, they've been paused, they've been rolled back in certain countries, implemented in certain countries. I want to talk about most recently. We had a 145% tariff on goods from China, a retaliatory tariff on goods being imported into China from the US. That on May 12th was actually rolled back. The US and China came to an agreement, and the US reduced reciprocal tariffs on China down to 10% plus a 20% baseline tariff on Chinese imports. And then China also cut their retaliatory tariffs on the US down to 10%. That is a 90-day term. It's set to, be implemented 90 days from May 14th, while negotiations are ongoing. But it is important to think, outside of just the energy piece, and I'm going to talk about Canada as well here, all of the goods that we're kind of importing, whether it's steel, aluminum, different things like that, they can affect what's happening with some of the projects. And, as part of the non-energy costs in New York, building new generation, new transmission infrastructure, upgrading some of that, some of the new offshore wind projects that are underway, a lot of the economics for these projects were run years ago to get financing, to get approvals, to go through kind of all the approvals that are needed at the state level, to move forward with these projects. And so when you have these tariffs being implemented onto supplies that would be needed for those projects, the economics for those projects can change and those costs can move higher. And so while there isn't a direct impact on energy imports right now from Canada, as those are excluded as part of the US MCA trade pact, you can see higher costs associated with some of the projects because of the tariffs on those goods. Separately from that, as I mentioned, we are seeing tariffs that are still in place on goods that are imported from Canada. However, energy for the time being has been excluded from that. However, if we see any shifts to that in the future, that certainly could impact the cost of energy as well. FERC has given authority to the New York ISO to collect and allocate costs related to duties on imports of any energy from Canada, should those at some point be implemented. So again, right now it's not a factor. Down the line, we'll kind of see, as a lot of this is fluid and evolving. And why that is important is because New York is a net importer of electricity from Canada. Like I said, we get a lot of hydroelectric power from Canada. And so if anything would shift with the mechanics of how, most recently these tariffs are being implemented, that could have an additional cost impact on the energy piece as well. The last thing I'll kind of say about this is just more generally, like you've probably been watching the stock market. I showed that chart of, not NYMEX gas prices. I think just the situation with how fluid this has been, how much you can see even looking at this chart, it's on again, off again, paused for 30 days, paused for 90 days. It has just caused a little bit of volatility in the markets, a little bit of volatility just more broadly for the economic situation. That's kind of brought up some fears of the potential for a recession. That then has an impact on prices in the energy market. So we saw oil prices move, significantly lower. All of these things have a ripple effect, because when oil moves down, if you see less oil production, we get less associated gas production in the US. So again, that makes supply tighter. So all of these kind of ripple effects from the tariffs, even though they're not directly impacting New York per se, they can have impacts to project costs, to, what the market is assessing in terms of demand, that's going to impact prices. And so it's really important to kind of keep an eye on what's going on with these. And it is one factor that's making forecasting even more difficult, because we're starting to see some breaks in how the fundamentals are tied to the price trends because of some of these economic issues that are going on with different changes to federal policy. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that. That being said,
Hey,
go ahead,
Britt,
Mark.
could you pause just for a second? Yes,
Sure.
for those who joined us late, I just wanted to let you know that if you have questions throughout the presentation, please put them in the chat, and we'll either take them up as they arise, or we will tackle them at the end of Britt's presentation. I also want to let people know that we are recording this session, and we will be making the recording available and the slides available on the megaenergy.org website. Thank you, Brett. Britt, this is great.
Sure, of course. Okay, so shifting back to the fundamentals a little bit, just in terms of natural gas and really electric power demand. Like I said, we see a strong correlation between gas and power prices, so we watch very closely what's happening with natural gas fundamentals. The two big things that we look at there, of course, are with supply, underground storage inventories, as well as US production levels. So storage has finally started to trend a little bit more bearish, with spring showing up and lacking any strong heating demand. But if you look at this chart on the top right-hand side, this is underground storage inventories. You can see that that orange that kind of dips below, we were in a large deficit after colder weather this winter. And then that blue dotted line is what's happening with prices. So there is a direct correlation between underground storage inventories and natural gas prices. When we are in a deficit, that's supportive of prices, or more bullish for prices. When we're in a surplus, we tend to see that flip. Most recently, we did see, because of some of this warmer weather and reduced demand, we did see some really strong injections into underground storage beginning as early as March, which isn't typical. That has helped to flip the storage deficit to the 5-year average to actually a surplus. So right now we finally flipped into a surplus of about 1.5%, but we still are at a deficit to year ago levels by about 16%. So the market will watch this closely through the summer to see how quickly we can rebuild underground inventories ahead of the winter. And that has, a big impact on kind of what happens with prices in the near term. At the same time, production and how quickly production can ramp up to meet summer demand also has an impact. If you look at the chart on the lower left-hand side, and I apologize, the title got cut off there, but this is dry gas production. You can see the blue line is tracking production this year, and it's really flattened out. So we've seen a couple of years, really a decade of year-over-year production growth. Last year was the first year that we saw that dynamic change, where we didn't just see growth. We started seeing production respond more to what was happening with prices. If you look at the black line from last year, that's production levels, and you can see that they really dropped off a few times throughout the year. So when prices moved lower, producers would withhold production, looking for higher prices. That would tighten supply demand. So we really are seeing this kind of fundamental shift as well out of producers domestically, where they're no longer just producing gas to produce gas. They're really looking for a return on investment. And if they're not getting it based on, break even prices, they're pulling back on production. And so this year we've seen production really flatten out when there was more growth predicted for this year. The trajectory of production moving forward is going to be really key for, kind of price formation moving forward as well. And a big part of why is demand growth. The chart on the top right-hand side here is looking at LNG export capacity in the US. You can see this goes out through 2030. Very significant demand growth over the next 5 years. The largest, for sure, demand driver in the gas market is the growth of LNG exports in this country. In 2024 and 2023, you can see we had a little bit of a pause. So we had the first, what we call the first wave of LNG projects, beginning in 2016 through 2022, a little bit of a pause in 23 and 24, but now you see beginning in 2025 through the end of this decade, significant demand growth in LNG exports, which is, really supporting prices longer term, the price forecast longer term. At the same time, if you look at the chart on the lower left-hand side, a lot of growth in the electric sector, really driven by artificial intelligence and crypto. That's fueling data center demand. And so huge projections for demand growth really across the US over the next few years in, the energy space. The New York ISO has received just shy of 900 megawatts of interconnection requests from data centers and hydrogen plants with in-service dates of next year. So, this is, again, a fundamental shift where for a long time we didn't really see demand growth in the energy space. And now over the next 5 years, we're expecting significant growth. So again, that's tightening the supply and demand balance, and that's been supportive of power and gas prices. This next slide, I'm not going to go into in detail, but it's just a couple of recent stories. Like I pulled all of these from either EIA or Intero Resources or different things within this past week. So you can see just story after story is reiterating and highlighting this sort of, demand growth, prices moving higher. You can see the bottom left-hand chart is the EIA's forecast for natural gas prices, and they're showing their change to that forecast from January of this year versus May of this year. And you can see how, just in the last few months, forecasts for prices have moved higher, again, based on this tightening in supply and demand balance. And so that's, important to kind of consider when you're looking at what to do with your energy strategy. The last slide that I have here is specific just to the New York ISO. So once a year, the New York ISO releases what they call their gold book. They recently published their gold book for 2025. It came out earlier this month. And you can see in the chart here, again, same story, that blue line is showing a kind of weather normalized baseline load forecast growth. The red line shows a higher demand growth scenario. So they run a couple of different models. But in every scenario, even the lower demand scenario, we are anticipating to see load growth in New York over the next few years. The 10-year forecast is for a rate of growth at 1.7%. And again, this has to do with the interconnection of large load projects, as well as electrification and, EV charging adoption, those sorts of things. The forecast also anticipates an increase of 1% for summer demand. And I think more critically, and of course we're approaching summer, but more critically to think about long-term is an increase of 2.7% for winter demand. And eventually, as we get out to 2030, even seeing New York eventually become a winter peaking system. And why that's important as well is, winter is really in the Northeast where you can see some significant price impacts. There's a lot of pipeline constraint. New England, our neighbor to, the north, relies on LNG imports in the winter. And so as New York flips to a winter peaking system, those price sensitivities and volatile prices are going to be exacerbated even from what they are, today. And so again, hedging a position, making sure you have a contract in place that gives you some protection, especially in the winter, is really key and something to be looking at, now, because really the outcome of this summer and where supply and demand is at the end of the summer is going to start to impact the winter strips as well.
Hey, Britt, while
Yeah.
we're on that slide, can you go back to that slide? There was a question of, can you define what a winter peaking season is?
Yeah, so right now, the way that capacity works in New York is that, and in New York, and it's different for different regions, but in New York, there is one peak hour that sets a customer's capacity tag for the next planning year. So basically, this summer, because New York is currently a summer peaking system, there's going to be 1 hour in, July or August, non-holiday. There's sort of different rules they set around that. And your usage during that hour is adjusted by a couple of scaling factors. And then that is part of what sets your demand charge or your capacity charge for the next planning year. Flipping to a winter peaking system means that with electrification and other things that are going on, expectations are that in the next, I believe it's in 2030 is when the New York ISO is forecasting it to flip, but we're going to have more demand in winter than in summer. And so the system will peak in the winter as opposed to the summer right now. Really, it's air conditioning demand that makes it peak in the summer. But as we see more electrification in the heating space and other things like that, you're expected to see that flip to winter. So if all things remain the same with the New York ISO, that would likely mean, that the winter peak would start to set customers' capacity tags. But also, and separate from that, we do just see more price volatility in the winter because in the summer, we have a lot of solar generation. We have some of these, other generation resources that are available, whereas in winter, you're much more constrained, especially in New York and New England, where, we're not drilling for gas. There's a lot more pipeline constraint, those sorts of things. It means that, prices can escalate much more quickly. You need to bring on reserves like dual fuel from oil and other resources, and those cost significantly more. And so, that's a factor to think about just in terms of like prices. If New York becomes a winter peaking system, that could bring more price volatility. It could require more resources, which could cost, more because you need to get those built or get, new technologies to make more resources available, that sort of thing.
Thank you.
Sure. So on that note, I wanted to kind of switch over and jump into some of the non-energy components. We just talked about demand, and so it's kind of a perfect slide into capacity. So capacity makes up, next to energy, capacity makes up the next largest kind of cost component for your supply charges. You can see it represented by that little red pie slice in the chart to the top. If you look at the chart in the lower right-hand side, this is looking at historic capacity prices. This chart is labeled ROS, which stands for rest of state. So in upstate New York, the prices that are applicable for load in upstate New York is rest of state. You can see these prices have been supported in recent years, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One, this tightening of supply and demand. It's anticipated with this load growth that we will need additional generating resources to show up to meet demand. We also, based on the state's kind of climate goals, are seeing a shift to more renewables. So in the last several years, we've seen, the retirement of some older, dirtier fossil units, and those those megawatts are being replaced by new renewable generation, which is more intermittent in nature. And so you need different technologies, battery storage to kind of show up, to deal with the intermittency that comes from those resources. And so, that's been supportive of prices. That's also meant that, reserve margins have kind of grown. And so this year we saw a higher reserve margin. And what that means is, like, if New York thinks that the peak is going to be X amount of megawatts, there is an additional need for capacity beyond that, just for security. So it's really what it sounds like, a reserve margin. So a 2.5% increase in reserve margin year over year is the equivalent of about 750 megawatts. So that's significant, and it's the market's way of incentivizing, this generation and these technologies to show up. That's been really supportive of prices. And so, both in New York City, where capacity costs are way more expensive, but also in rest of state, you've seen capacity prices supported as we're seeing kind of this shift to the generation landscape, where there's, retirements maybe outpacing additions. Also, the additions that we see are renewables and more intermittent. So you need these other technologies, and there's a cost tied to that. And that's, why you see this being supported. The last thing I'll kind of mention on this is there's a big effort underway at the New York ISO right now, as well as some of the neighboring regions like PJM and New England, to really take a look at the capacity market and make sure that it is, working efficiently, providing appropriate price signals for investment to ensure reliability. And so I do think that that's hopefully going to help kind of keep a lid on where capacity prices move in the near term. But nonetheless, and you can see in this chart, prices have been supported, and I expect that to kind of continue through the summer. And, also kind of going back to the winter note, typically capacity prices have always been more expensive in the summer. We have started to see, seasonally, winter prices moving higher as well. And so this is going to be important to consider moving forward in your strategy for whether or not you fix capacity or pass it through. Maybe some folks that historically pass through capacity expecting to kind of get a benefit of those lower winter costs, you're going to start to see those kind of disappear as we kind of move into a more of a winter peaking system. So there could be some strategy there just in terms of how you handle capacity, and potentially look at fixing it to avoid some of those seasonal volatility risks. And the two other big ones are transmission and then the clean energy standard. This slide is looking at transmission project updates. I know that, there's a lot of words and it's a pretty busy slide, but I think it's all kind of important to look at. So the chart on the right-hand side comes from the New York ISO. It just takes a look at what some of these projects are and where they're located. Both projects that are tied to what's called the New York Public Policy Transmission Projects, or PPT, as well as, other projects that are tied into different programs from the state. Two that are listed here were from NYSERDA's Tier 4 REC project. But the kind of key thing to highlight here is before 2019, there really weren't any transmission project costs that were included on the supply side of the bill. So I mentioned on that first slide, your supply bill is broken into distribution charges, which are like mostly transmission charges from the utility, and then supply charges, which, are the things that we've been talking about that would come from a retail supplier like Constellation Energy. Over the last 5 years, with all of these new transmission projects and upgrades in New York State, a lot of these project costs have fallen on the supply side of the bill, which has meant new transmission costs, that didn't even exist, before 2019, that are associated with these projects. So there's work in project charges, there's charges once, these projects come into service. And the way it works right now, at least for the public policy transmission, is that there's what's called like a ratepayer like beneficiary. So they socialize these costs, but whatever zones benefit the most from the project carry a higher like load share ratio of those costs. So I included a little chart here that shows estimated project costs, going back the last few years. You can see those in groupings by zone. So like zone A, for example, has higher costs than zones B, C, D, and E because one of the projects, the Western New York Transmission Project, was a bigger benefit to zone A. So zone A carries a greater share of those costs. The same is true for like zone F. Zone F benefited from the AC transmission policy project. And so zone F carries a greater share of those costs. And so that's why you see some of the swings from zone to zone. The other thing to mention here that's really important, and when we look at some of the energy price charts, what you'll see is even though zones, F maybe carries a higher transmission charge, you also see a little bit of relief in the energy charge in zone F because of the improvement in congestion. So these projects are not just, a cost that's being passed through based on the project costs themselves. They're also shifting the historic congestion patterns in the state. And that's having an impact on energy prices for those zones as well. And so I wanted to really, highlight that because again, it's why sometimes you see a little bit of a break from the fundamentals or like, why are prices in zone A moving higher for energy, but lower in zone J, which is like unusual? Well, as you build out infrastructure that helps move power from upstate to downstate, you're limiting congestion there. So downstate prices are moving lower, but now upstate prices are moving higher because that energy can move more efficiently. It's like worth more instead of being kind of isolated into that load pocket. So important things to kind of think about. The last thing that I'll note here is one of the tier 4 projects, from NYSERDA has the Clean Energy Standard Program, like I mentioned. Tier 4 RECs are for RECs that are specifically going to go into New York City. There were 2 projects tied to that program, Champlain Hudson Power Express and Clean Path Connect. 2 points I wanted to make is Clean Path Connect was recently canceled, at least that tier 4 REC contract was canceled. There was a plethora of reasons, but economics was one of them. So going back to that earlier conversation around inflation, tariffs, those impacts, Champlain Hudson Power Express is expected in service next year. But again, there are risks of delays and other things just based on the economics, really kind of driven by what's happening with federal tariff policy and other things. And New York is modeling all of their reliability studies at this point in time on Champlain Hudson Power Express being in service in 2026. And so, if there are any issues with that project and its ability to be on time or move forward, it could have significant impacts to, reliability modeling, and that would be supportive of prices as well. So again, there's a lot of moving parts to these things that need to be considered.
Hey, Britt, can you explain to our audience what a REC is?
Yeah, so a REC is a renewable energy credit. And basically, so I flipped to this next slide, so it's a good time to kind of talk about it. So right now, as part of the Clean Energy Standard in New York, NYSERDA sort of runs this program in coordination with the New York ISO and other stakeholders. But a REC is a renewable energy credit. In this case, it is one that is generated in New York State. That is, part of the tier 1 REC program. And there's two programs. There's a voluntary market and then a mandatory market. As part of your supply costs, you pay a REC rate tied to the mandatory market, which is, like I said, run by NYSERDA. And so you can see in the chart on the right-hand side where REC costs have kind of moved over the last few years. I also included ZEC costs in here, which are zero emissions credits. So there's a renewable energy credit, a zero emission credit. Renewable is tied more to like wind, solar, those sorts of things. ZECs are tied to the nuclear generation units in upstate New York. But you can see again how these have moved over time. And this program was implemented, I want to say around 2016 as well. So these were costs that were not included before then and are fairly significant. RECs have remained pretty flat, even came down in the last few years, but tier 1 REC costs have moved higher. There was a little bit of a dip this year because of a change in the program and the way NYSERDA collected those costs. But nonetheless, this is $4 or $3, $4, $5 a megawatt hour. That's pretty significant when you think about the fact that several years ago that wasn't even a cost component. And so again, there's costs tied into some of these programs. And when you look at like an all-in fixed price or a contract rate, or you're thinking about kind of strategy about what to fix, what to pass through, understanding kind of what's happened with these price trends, where they are expected to go moving forward, can help, form your strategy for how you handle those in your contract. What we are seeing, I will just mention anecdotally now, especially with the shift in the REC program and how NYSERDA kind of collects those costs, as well as a little bit of uncertainty, I think, just more broadly around, the state's goals versus what the federal administration is kind of doing. Is there is a little bit of uncertainty in these markets. So it's not a bad time to consider maybe handling like tier 1 REC cost as a pass-through, whereas before it was very common to kind of fix those into your costs because there are some unknowns around that. And the last kind of note I'll make about that is, one of the programs that's in the pipeline but has not yet been implemented is the offshore wind program. And offshore wind has had a ton of issues with contracts getting canceled because of economics. So NYSERDA ran a ton of solicitations, had contracts with 7 or 8 offshore wind projects that were all canceled because by the time those projects were ready to go under construction, the economics no longer really worked. And those were canceled. There are 2 projects right now that have contracts with NYSERDA. One of those, Empire Wind, was actually ordered to stop construction last month. I saw a note this morning that it's been resolved. So I think the governor of New York released a notice today that that project is going to move forward. But it's still worth mentioning that the fate of that project was kind of up in the air this past month because of some of these dynamics that I'm talking about. So again, I think some uncertainty in the marketplace moving forward, not just for New York right now, but more generally, which makes it a little bit harder to predict the future of these costs. So, while it might make a lot of sense to fix energy or fix capacity or fix ancillaries, looking at doing some sort of pass through or price adjust for the clean energy standard piece probably, is something to consider at this point in time. And the last couple slides I have here are really just the price trend charts. And so these are pretty quick to go through, but I really just want to kind of reiterate the point that, we've seen energy prices moving higher. We've seen natural gas prices moving higher. The catalyst for that across the board is tightening of supply and demand, projections for demand growth, both in the short term and longer term. This chart is looking at Henry Hub natural gas calendar strips. And so, you can see how much things have moved higher. Right now, calendar 26 is priced much higher than calendar 29. And so I mentioned that word backwardation. That's when the longer term, curves are trading at a discount to the near term. With all of the fundamentals we talked about, that doesn't really make sense right now. So it's presenting a really good opportunity to look at, hedging or fixing a position longer term, because we kind of feel that those prices are not reflective of the supply and demand situation that we're going to be in those outer years. The same is true for energy prices. So again, this blue part of the pie here is what we're looking at in this chart. It's the energy piece, and you can see for zone A, prices have really moved higher over this last year. And the reason that you'll see, and I'm just going to flip forward to kind of highlight what I mean. This is zone F. Zone F has been a little bit more flat over the last 3 years, even though we've seen some upside more recently, not to the same effect as like zone A. So this is where you can really see how some of those transmission projects that have been built have impacted, congestion, and then impacted the energy piece, changing kind of, the patterns and price trends, zone to zone. But nonetheless, across the board, we see this backwardation where longer term, so looking at, calendar 27, calendar 28, calendar 29, it's at a discount to near term. So, calendar 26 right now for zone A is priced closer to, $52, whereas calendar 29 is at $46. Like, that's significant, right? That's $6. So if you have the ability to take a longer position to fix, further out the curve, you could see kind of the benefit of locking in at a rate when, prices could potentially move higher for those outer years. And that's across the board. Like I mentioned, zone F, similar, near term, 64, a little less backwardation in zone F, which again is reflective of some of those like transmission patterns and shifts that I mentioned. The last power slides here are just looking at the index price. So instead of the futures, this is looking at, where historic prices have been. I think, again, just highlights the volatility, but also, you can see in this chart across the board, things have moved up, even in shoulder season, even in non-peak periods. We're at a different place than we were, 5 years ago in 2020, where prices hit all-time lows driven by the pandemic. But, prices for 2025 right now averaging just shy of $60 in, zone C in this case, whereas last year, $34. So really prices year over year are higher. Prices compared to the 5-year average are higher. So mitigating some of this volatility and uncertainty, looking at, kind of where the fundamentals are, where these prices are, taking advantage of the dips in the market, makes a lot of sense given all the uncertainty. And that's sort of the last slide that I have here in closing is, just a couple of key takeaways about that. The tightening of load growth, or the tightening of supply and demand, a lot of load growth, these different projects that we see, things being very in flux, both at the state level and at the federal level because of tariff policy. It is adding a lot of uncertainty into what's already a really volatile market. And, like I said, even though energy for the time being appears to be isolated from some of the tariffs, the materials and supplies that are necessary for that infrastructure are not. And, also I think we're likely to kind of continue to see a little bit of a test between state policy and federal policy that can move some of these projects and prices around. And then lastly, the impact of summer temperatures are going to definitely be a factor in, what happens in terms of prices this winter, what happens in terms of prices next summer, because the market kind of looks to the most recent season. So, making sure you are well informed on some of these issues so that they can help inform your strategy for contracting is really important. And on that note, I will kind of wrap things up. I don't know, Mark, if any other questions came in, I'm happy to address those now.
We do have one question. I want to remind everybody, if you have a question for Britt, and she's an expert in this field, if you haven't figured that out, I learn something new every time I hear you talk. Thank you very much. We have one question that we haven't hit on yet, which is in the nearer term, how would a Russia-Ukraine ceasefire impact the liquefied natural gas export demand?
So it obviously right now, and I have a slide that maybe when I send out the slide deck or provide to you, I can include that shows a little graphic of this. But basically, right now, the situation between Russia and Ukraine has meant that Europe is taking less gas from Russia. And again, I have a chart that really kind of shows this. I mean, Nord Stream pipeline was blown up. There's, less imports going across the border into Europe or Ukraine. And so that has been bullish for LNG, certainly, and especially like this summer, I think prices are supported because Europe is going to be reliant on, more US LNG. A ceasefire could definitely have an impact to that outlook. However, simultaneously, the European Union has basically is looking at policy right now that is even further reducing their ability to take gas and oil from Russia. And so again, there's a lot of fluidity around that. If that moves through, I believe the year that would become effective is 2027. And so that would be more bullish for US LNG. And so we're kind of waiting to see the outcome of some of that. Now, this is in terms of like LNG into the EU. But even if something materially changed where, the EU started taking more gas or oil from Russia again, which again, regardless of the ceasefire, like it doesn't really appear to be the case based on policy the EU is trying to pass right now. But even if it does, there's still off takers like globally, Asia, Latin America. Like I don't think long term you're going to see a major shift to the load growth determinations for LNG, just because we right now are the cheapest. We have the cheapest cost for gas globally. Like we looked at those charts for Henry Hub, $3, $3.50 right now, like $4 in the long-term view. Whereas like Europe, closer to 12 to 14, like depending. Asia, same thing. And so I think we're going to continue to see demand, whether or not it's in Europe, based on kind of the policies there or in other countries, just because it's cheaper to produce gas here, and producers are making a good return on investments to liquefy that gas. And even with liquefaction costs and shipping costs, they can still make money sending it to these other places where gas is priced a lot higher. And so while it could shift a little bit, I think, of at least Europe's reliance on LNG, I don't think it's going to really materially shift the big picture all that much.
Great. Thank you very much. I want to thank the members of the Municipal Electric and Gas Alliance and the New York State Association of Counties for joining us here today. If you learned something today, please pass along the recording and the slides to your colleagues in your county or in your municipality or school district, and even those outside of that you think would learn something from this presentation. Britt, as always, I thank you for your expertise. I learned something new today, and I do every time you speak, so I appreciate that. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Take care.